So now we're looking at the cosine graph, and again, it has to be one-to-one to talk about its inverse. So now, if I look at the portion between 0 and pi, and restrict my attention just to that portion of the graph, it now is one-to-one, so we can talk about it has an inverse. So the interval is between 0 and pi. Okay, let's look at the first one. Cosine is in the right triangle tree is adjacent over hypotenuse, so square root of 2 over 2 is for a 45-degree angle. So therefore, the inverse of the cosine, the angle whose cosine is the square root of 2 over 2 in the interval between 0 and pi is pi over 4, representing our answer in radian measure. Next one, the angle whose cosine is negative 1/2. So negative 1/2 would be in the second quadrant between pi over 2 and pi. So when you're looking at the cosine, again, it's adjacent over hypotenuse, it would be 60 degrees. But we're not doing the fourth quadrant, that's where cosine is positive. So when you're thinking about a 60-degree angle placed in the second quadrant, because cosine is negative in the second, then the angle that we're talking about is this angle here. The angle whose cosine is negative 1/2. So the angle is 120 degrees, 180 minus 60. And then you put pi over 180 and reduce it. So we're getting 2 pi over 3. So in the interval between 0 and pi, the angle whose cosine is negative square root of 2 over 2, the angle whose cosine is positive square root of 2 over 2 is 45, or pi over 4. But since it's negative, we're talking about it being in the second quadrant. So you're placing the 45-degree angle in the second quadrant and finding this angle. 180 minus 45 is 135. So it's 135 pi over 180. And divide each numerator and denominator by 45, you get 3 pi over 4 in radian measure. The next one, the angle whose cosine is 1/2, would be adjacent over hypotenuse. That would be 60 degrees. And 60 degrees in radian measure is pi over 3. If we look at the tangent graph between 0 and pi, and then we look between 0 and pi over 2, then if we look between pi over 2 and pi, it's not continuous. So therefore, when I'm looking for an interval where it's going to be one-to-one, I'm going to have to go between negative pi over 2 and pi over 2, just like I did for sine. So 0 is less than or equal to negative pi over 2 is less than or equal to x is less than or equal to pi over 2. Yeah. Okay, in this one I'm saying the angle whose tangent is 0. So between negative pi over 2 and pi over 2, tangent has a value of 0 for 0 degrees. So y must be equal to 0, or 0 radians. Okay, here we have the angle whose tangent is negative square root of 3. Well, positive square root of 3 would be in the first quadrant. It would be pi over 3, 60 degrees. But we have to restrict our attention to negative pi over 2 to pi over 2. Therefore, it must be in the fourth quadrant. And so it would be a negative pi over 3. Square root of 3 over 3 is for 30 degrees. It's positive, so you're in the first quadrant, and it would be pi over 6.